Story 1: Whispers in the Woods. The forest stretched endlessly before Daniel as he stepped out of his car, breathing in the crisp autumn air. His golden retriever, Max, jumped out after him, tail wagging excitedly. The parking lot of the remote state forest was empty, just as he had expected. It was why he had chosen this spot. Complete isolation, a break from the noise of the city, and a chance to reconnect with nature. Daniel slung his backpack over his shoulder, securing his water bottle and a few snacks inside. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light through the dense canopy. He checked his phone, no signal. Perfect. This was exactly what he needed. He clicked his tongue, signaling Max to follow, and together, they started down the trail. The silence of the woods was peaceful at first. Birds chirped in the distance, leaves rustled underfoot, and the gentle rush of a river echoed through the trees. But as he moved deeper into the forest, that peace began to shift. It wasn't immediate, but something subtle changed in the atmosphere. The birdsong faded. The wind stilled. The woods grew silent. Daniel glanced at Max, who had stopped walking. The dog's ears perked up, his nose twitching as if sniffing the air for something unseen. "What is it, buddy?" Daniel asked, patting Max's head. The dog let out a low, uneasy whine. Shrugging it off, Daniel continued forward, leaving the marked trail behind as he followed the sound of the river. He had always been an adventurer at heart, and the idea of exploring beyond the beaten path excited him. The landscape sloped upward, forcing him to push through thick underbrush. Finally, he reached a clearing on a small hill overlooking the river below. That's when he heard it. A voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Daniel froze. He turned his head, scanning the forest, but saw no one. His grip tightened on Max's leash. The dog let out a soft growl, staring in the direction of the sound. "Hello," Daniel called out, his voice breaking the eerie silence. No response. Then the voice came again, closer this time. It wasn't clear. It was more like a whisper carried by the wind, barely audible yet impossible to ignore. It sent a chill down his spine. Daniel swallowed hard. Maybe there was someone out here after all? A lost hiker? Park ranger? But why would they be whispering? He took a hesitant step forward, peering through the trees. Still nothing. Max suddenly barked, the sound sharp and alarmed. The force of it startled Daniel, who stumbled back. The whispering stopped abruptly, as if whoever had been speaking had heard them and gone silent. Daniel's pulse quickened. Something felt wrong. He had hiked alone before, but he had never felt this kind of unease. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but curiosity fought back. Maybe it was just his imagination? Taking a deep breath, he decided to head back. But as he turned, the whispering returned. This time, surrounding him from all directions. Daniel's breath hitched. The whispers weren't just one voice anymore. They were multiple, overlapping, unintelligible. Some fast, some slow, some sounding right behind him. His heart pounded against his ribs as panic clawed at his chest. Max was barking wildly now, pulling on the leash as if urging Daniel to run. And then, suddenly, the whispers stopped. The forest went deathly silent again. Daniel swallowed hard, scanning the trees. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow flitting between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be human. Daniel took a step back and then another. The air around him felt heavy, thick, almost suffocating. His mind screamed at him to move. He turned on his heel and ran, Max sprinting beside him. Branches whipped against his arms and face, but he didn't stop. The whispering returned, louder now, frantic, as if the voices were angry. Footsteps, no rustling, echoed behind him. Something was chasing them. The parking lot wasn't far. He just had to reach the car. His lungs burned, legs aching as he pushed himself faster. The whispers grew deafening, swirling around him like a storm. Then, just as he broke through the tree line into the open lot, silence. Nothing. The voices were gone. Daniel staggered to his car, fumbling for his keys with shaking hands. He yanked the door open, practically shoving Max inside before jumping in himself. He locked the doors and sat there, chest heaving, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Slowly, he turned to look back at the forest. It looked the same as before, peaceful, quiet, innocent. But Daniel knew better. Resolution, the haunting memory. He never spoke about what happened in that forest. Not to his friends, not to his family. But he never returned either. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of him, and he searched online for anything about that area. He found stories, accounts from other hikers who had heard strange voices, seen shadows moving in the trees. Some claimed it was a burial site long forgotten. Others believed the forest itself was alive, whispering to those who dared to enter. Daniel didn't care to know the truth. He only knew one thing for sure. The whispers were real, and they had never wanted him to leave. Story 2: The Shadow Window. Lena had always loved the quiet of small towns. After years of city noise and sleepless nights, she finally found her peace in a quaint little house on the edge of Willow Creek. It was the last house on the street, backing onto dense woods that whispered with the wind. The town itself was friendly enough, the kind of place where people smiled in passing but didn't pry. Perfect for someone like Lena, who preferred solitude over social calls. The first week passed uneventfully. She unpacked, arranged her bookshelves, and started her new routine. Early morning walks, long afternoons with a book, and tea on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. It was the life she had always wanted, until she noticed the shadow. It started with a feeling, a prickle on the back of her neck, whenever she passed the large window in the living room. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, an old habit from living in a place where danger lurked around every corner. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger each night. Then she saw it. One evening, as she curled up on the couch with a novel, she glanced toward the window. A dark shape stood at the edge of the trees. Her heart pounded. The figure didn't move, just stood there, barely distinguishable in the twilight. She blinked, and it was gone. Maybe it was a trick of the light, she reasoned. Maybe she was just tired. The next night, it returned. This time, she kept her eyes locked on the figure, watching for movement. None came, just a silent, motionless presence watching from the trees. A deep unease settled over her. She closed the curtains and tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. Days passed, and the shadow remained. Every night at the same spot, just standing there. Lena tried telling herself it was just her imagination, but then the knocks began. Soft at first, barely noticeable over the rustling leaves outside. Tap, 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 at her bedroom window. The first time it happened, she was frozen in bed, clutching her blankets. She didn't move until the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains. The next night, the knocking came again, more insistent. She gathered the courage to look out, but there was nothing. Only the trees swaying in the wind. She told herself it was just the old house settling, the wind playing tricks. But as the days wore on, the knocks spread: her front door, the living room window, the back porch. She stopped sleeping, too afraid of the sound that always came at night. Then the footsteps began. Faint at first, crunching on the gravel path outside her house. She convinced herself it was an animal, but the sounds were rhythmic, deliberate, human. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone nearby. They assured her it was probably just her nerves and left her with a warning to lock her doors. Lena started keeping the lights on, every curtain drawn, every door locked. But no matter how secure she made her home, the shadow remained. One night, desperation drove her to a breaking point. She sat by the window with a flashlight, determined to catch whoever or whatever was tormenting her. Hours passed, and the figure didn't appear. Just as she was about to give up, she heard it. A whisper, not from outside but inside the house. Cold fear gripped her. The sound was faint, just behind her ear, a breath against her skin. She turned sharply, flashlight beam sweeping across the room. Nothing. Her heart hammered as she stepped backward, every nerve screaming. Then she heard it again. Closer. She ran. Fumbling with the locks, she yanked open the front door and sprinted down the street, not stopping until she reached the police station. This time, they took her seriously. Officers escorted her back home, checking every room, every closet, every shadowy corner. There was nothing out of place. No sign of forced entry, no explanation for the voice she had heard. But when she walked into her bedroom, she saw it. On the window pane, pressed against the glass, was a single handprint, larger than her own, smudged, as though whoever left it had been watching, waiting. That was the last night Lena spent in Willow Creek. By morning, she packed her things and left, never looking back. The house sat empty for years, eventually falling into disrepair. Some say it's still haunted by the shadow in the woods, waiting for the next person who dares to call it home. Story 3: The House at End of the Road. There was something different about the house at the end of the road. It had been abandoned for years, yet no one ever dared to go near it. Children whispered stories about ghosts and curses, and even the adults, who claimed not to believe in such things, avoided walking past it after dark. The house stood tall, its wooden exterior worn and gray, with windows that reflected nothing but darkness. When Daniel and his mother moved to town, they rented a house just 2 doors away from the abandoned one. His mother, a firm woman with no patience for superstitions, dismissed the town's warnings. "It's just an old house," she said whenever someone tried to tell her otherwise. Daniel wasn't so sure. He had seen strange movements in the windows at night, flickers of shadows that shouldn't have been there. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel walked home from his friend's house. The shortcut led him right past the old house. As he hurried his steps, a noise stopped him in his tracks. A creak, like someone stepping on an old wooden floor. He turned his head sharply. The house was silent, but the front door, which had always been closed, was slightly ajar. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Every instinct told him to run home, but curiosity rooted him in place. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe someone had finally moved in. But deep down, he knew neither was true. Against all logic, he stepped toward the house. The door groaned as he pushed it open further. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of something old and forgotten. Moonlight spilled through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows across the warped wooden floor. The furniture was covered in white sheets, ghostly forms in the dim light. A noise came from upstairs, a soft, shuffling sound. Daniel's heart pounded, but his legs carried him forward. The staircase creaked under his weight as he climbed, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top, a long hallway stretched before him, lined with doors that stood slightly open, as if waiting for him. He hesitated, then moved toward the last door on the right. Something about it felt different. His fingers trembled as he reached for the handle. The door swung open with a whisper of air, revealing a small, dust-covered bedroom. A single rocking chair sat in the corner, slowly moving back and forth, though there was no wind. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, but before he could leave, a voice, faint and hoarse, spoke from the darkness. "You came back." A chill swept through him. He wanted to run, but his body refused to move. The voice sounded sad, almost pleading. "Please don't go." With trembling hands, Daniel reached for his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the rocking chair. It was empty, but the dust on the seat was disturbed, as if someone had been sitting there just moments before. His pulse thundered in his ears. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then the temperature in the room dropped, and a gust of icy air brushed past him. The closet door to his left creaked open an inch. Daniel took a step back, his foot hitting a loose floorboard. The house seemed to exhale around him, the air pressing down as if it were alive. He couldn't stay. He bolted down the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. As he reached the front door, he dared to glance back. For a brief moment, in the reflection of the dusty hallway mirror, he saw her, a young girl in an old-fashioned dress, her pale face framed by long, dark hair. She was watching him with sorrowful eyes. Then she was gone. Daniel didn't stop running until he was safely inside his own house. He slammed the door behind him, gasping for air. His mother looked up from the couch, startled. "Daniel? What's wrong?" He shook his head, unable to find the words. How could he explain what he had seen? That night, he lay awake in bed, heart still racing. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of the light, but deep down he knew the truth. The house at the end of the road wasn't empty. It never had been. The next morning, Daniel walked past the old house again, this time in daylight. It looked the same as always, worn, silent, abandoned. But as he turned to leave, something in the upstairs window caught his eye. The curtain moved, ever so slightly, as if someone was standing just behind it, watching him. He never took the shortcut again.